Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a comprehensive journey right through the core concepts of Unit 5. We're going to move from the deep philosophy of environmental values all the way into heavy-duty mechanical waste disposal and finally wrap up with some landmark legal history. If you've been following the discussions around sustainability, you know exactly how crucial these elements are. Here is our roadmap for Unit 5 today. We'll start with 1, the values crisis. Then we'll move into 2, the 3 R's of waste. After that, we'll heat things up with 3, the power of incineration, and we'll close it all out with 4, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Let's get right to it. Starting off with Section 1, the values crisis, cultural versus environmental. To really understand our modern environmental challenges, we first have to look in the mirror. For the longest time, society operated under this mindset where we only recognized cultural values. Basically, we cared about what we could build and produce, but we completely ignored the natural atmosphere. The crazy part is, we actually achieved our cultural goals by directly damaging environmental values. Think about it like this. Cultural values are everything produced by us humans, but almost always at the expense of nature. Environmental values, on the other hand, are the natural foundation of our world. When we damage that natural basis with our aggressive behavior, we create a massive crisis of non-sustainability. It's a lot like sawing off the very branch we're sitting on. So how do we shift our behaviors? That brings us to Section 2, the 3 R's of waste, practical solutions. You've definitely heard these before: reduce, reuse, and recycle. But looking at them through the lens of Unit 5, you realize these aren't just catchy buzzwords. They are the absolute bedrock of solid waste management. Implementing these 3 principles helps us save massive amounts of energy, conserve raw materials, and drastically cut down on pollution. They are literally our first line of defense. What's genuinely interesting is how simple the first and arguably most important step actually is. Reduce just means using fewer resources from the get-go. By simply saying no to plastic bags or skipping printing that useless paper, you directly limit the waste produced before it ever even becomes a problem. It's all about stopping the cycle right at the source. But hey, we can't reduce or reuse absolutely everything, right? That's where the 3rd R steps in: recycle. This literally means the reprocessing of our discarded materials. It's taking what we would normally just call trash and magically transforming it into brand new, actually helpful merchandise. The industrial examples from our sources are honestly pretty mind-blowing. We're not just talking about making new paper out of old paper here. Old steel cans, they get melted down into literal automobile bodies and construction materials. Discarded paper gets chemically processed into polysaccharide insulation for buildings. And atomic number 13, yeah, good old aluminum, along with glass bottles, can be melted down and recast into entirely new containers infinitely. We are literally rebuilding our world from our own waste. All right, let's move on to Section 3, the power of incineration, mechanical disposal. Because let's be realistic for a second. What happens to the highly dangerous, flammable, or super organic municipal solid waste that we just cannot safely recycle? Well, you could use composting or landfilling, which are definitely cheaper. But incineration? Well, it costs a whole lot more. It's a remarkably hygienic thermal method. It absolutely detoxifies highly flammable pathogens and dangerous materials that you definitely do not want just sitting around in a local landfill. Let's walk through how this heavy-duty mechanical disposal actually works. It's a 3-step process. First, you have to separate the combustible rubbish from the non-combustible stuff, like glass and metal, which goes back to being recycled. Second, since municipal waste is usually pretty wet, you have to completely dry it out in a massive preheater. And finally, you feed that dried refuse right into the incinerating chamber to burn. To give you a real sense of the sheer scale here, this massive incinerating chamber, which, by the way, has the incredibly cool name of the Destructor, can process an astounding 100 to 150 tons of waste every single hour. To put that into perspective, that is like incinerating the weight of a fully grown blue whale every 60 minutes. It's a massive continuous operation of waste elimination. And here is the absolute best part of this thermal process. This isn't just about making trash disappear. Because this waste has a very high calorific value, it burns incredibly hot, and we actually capture all that immense heat. We use it to create steam power, which then spins turbines to generate electricity. We are taking a giant societal problem and turning it into a highly potent energy resource. Now, it's really vital to note that this is not a perfect vanishing act. Even with all that intense heat, about 10 to 20% of the waste is left behind as ashes and heavy residues known as clinkers. And yep, those leftovers still require physical disposal, usually back in a landfill. So even our absolute best mechanical solutions have physical limits. Which perfectly tees up our final segment today, Section 4, Wildlife Protection Act 1972, the legal framework. Managing our massive output of waste is honestly only half the battle. To truly protect our environmental values, we also need strict legal frameworks. This landmark legal journey officially kicked off in 1972 with the Wildlife Protection Act, aimed at protecting animals and birds. But as you can see on this timeline, a massive structural shift happened just 4 years later, in 1976. This 1976 power shift is a huge detail you definitely need to take away from Unit 5. Basically, they legally transferred wildlife from the state list over to the concurrent list. Why does that matter? Because it finally gave the central government shared jurisdiction. They were empowered to step in and enforce sweeping environmental protections uniformly across the entire nation, instead of relying on a messy patchwork of state rules. This act also provided for the constitution of the Indian Board of Wildlife, or the IBWL. They became the crucial boots-on-the-ground organization responsible for actually using these new central powers. They actively took up the massive task of physically setting up the wildlife national parks and sanctuaries that we still rely on today. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today in this explainer, from the deep philosophy of our values to the mechanics of destructors, all the way to power shifts in environmental law. So as we wrap up Unit 5, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Are our current legal frameworks and these modern waste practices really enough? Can we finally step away from those damaging cultural values and get back to sustaining true environmental values for our planet's future? Think about that as you go about your day. Thanks for exploring this with me.